Aaron Cunanan, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here. I must say that I've been following your work for quite a long time, so it's an honor to actually be on the podcast. You've had a lot of my mentors on, so it's great to be able to contribute a little bit to your show as well.
No, thank you very much. I'm sure you've done a number of these, and I wasn't going to ask you this, but because you mentioned it, I will do. Who would you consider mentors?
I'd say Duncan French definitely, Jeff Head as well, John Wagle, three that definitely come to mind that have been really kind of monumental influences on me as a professional, as a person. So yeah.
And not just because you've said those three, and I'm glad you said those three, but three incredible people as well.
Yeah, no,
Incredible at what they
absolutely.
do, but
Yeah,
incredible people. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, nice. Okay, that was my first question before the
Nice,
intro,
nice, easy
but
warm up.
yeah, get you eased in. So, anyone that doesn't know who you are, and would you mind just giving us a bit of a short bio on what you're currently doing, what you've done before, and maybe how you met these three mentors
Yeah,
along the way?
yeah. So it's been kind of a winding journey, as a lot of us have. But currently, I am the director of applied sports science for the Cincinnati Reds, wrapping up my second year with the organization, going into our third year next year. Prior to that, I was at the UFC Performance Institute as the performance support manager in 2021. In 2020, I was with the San Francisco Giants, another baseball role, and kind of before getting into baseball, I got my start in sport as a weightlifter, mediocre weightlifting athlete. Um, kind of transition into coaching from that was never really on my radar. I started undergrad as an English education major, but through some different events and life experiences, found the sport of weightlifting. Like I said, transition into coaching. I was really fortunate. The weightlifting program that I was at is headed by Dr. Kyle Pierce, who I think still currently is on the IWF, International Weightlifting Federation. He's on their coaching and research committee, very involved with, um, you know, sports science research within weightlifting, involved with international programs in weightlifting around the world. So it was a really cool front row seat during my early days of a developing coach, seeing a systematic program and process and approach to an Olympic sport. That definitely shaped a lot of my early thoughts of what coaching could be or should be, how to develop, like I said, just a systematic approach to the training process, a long-term training process. Um, so that guided my early development as a coach, like I said, and then getting like a secondhand view to a lot of these other well-established um, training programs across the world and seeing the caliber of coaches at these other successful programs definitely gave me sort of a template of how I thought would be the best route to go about my development as a coach, first and foremost. And then as I continued down that journey pursuing higher education, I got my master's degree in kinesiology, but then noticed the pattern across the world internationally. A lot of these top level coaches, program directors had PhDs in some, human performance related field. So I thought that that's probably a signal that, I should probably go down the same route as kind of a template for success for these individuals. So that definitely stoked my interest in pursuing even more education. Um, During the same time, again, just being exposed to these Olympic programs opened my eyes to beyond just the world of coaching in and of itself, of all of these different other areas, nutrition, sports psych, sport medicine, all of those things that are part of a comprehensive and holistic approach to training and development. Um, and being exposed to kind of that bigger picture coordination of all of these different pieces got me a little bit more interested on that, um, on that more general side of things, not just focused solely on coaching, but from a performance management side of things. So that kind of shifted my lens or perspective of what I wanted to do and develop. So I ended up going to East Tennessee State University for my PhD in sport physiology and performance. Got to study under Dr. Mike Stone, Coach Meg Stone, all the great faculty members and peers that were there. John Wagle being one of them. We were in the same cohort during our PhD. So that was a really really great experience to continue to develop as a coach, but then also to add that sports science side of things, of diving into being a sports scientist alongside being a coach as well. That really opened my eyes to a lot of different different challenges and issues and approaches that I draw on in my current role. And finished that up in 2019, which led into the Giants role, my first, kind of professional role after the PhD. So really long kind of, journey that was really fortunate due to some just luck, good timing, right opportunity, right place sort of things. Um, During that, leading up to my PhD, I was very much a weightlifting kind of background and experience, like I said, as an athlete and coach. And as I was getting ready to transition from the PhD to the job market, recognized the need to kind of expand my experience and my resume. So during that time, also had the opportunity during the PhD to do an internship at the UFC Performance Institute in strength and conditioning. So that was my first stint at the UFC. Got to work under Bo Sandoval when he was still there, Duncan French, and then we got to reunite again in 21. So um, been, like I said, just very fortunate with the opportunities I've been able to have. Um, Try to capitalize on just the timing of different things and approach things to the best of my ability. And here we are in an exciting time just in baseball, but then also for our organization, a lot of really exciting things that kind of drew me over back into the baseball world. Um,
You saw me furiously scribbling down lots of things there straight away. I've got loads of questions for you. And it links into one of your mentors, actually, because John, I think it was definitely supporting Austin Driggers with an article on Sportsmith probably a year ago now about their influence on their thinking around how it integrates within team sports and how it integrates within baseball, which led me to think what influences it had on you in terms of do you very much have a weightlifting? I hate the word bias because that obviously instantly makes you think negative. But do you have that it kind of inbuilt in you, and it's been a thread through your career in terms of programming? And
I'd
is it followed you
say,
in the different sports?
yeah. I mean, I think I'm one that I definitely recognize there's undoubtedly benefits to weightlifting, including weightlifting movements in a program. That's not the only way to achieve, similar types of adaptations. I think the article that you mentioned by Austin and John pointed out a lot of just the realities of sport that a lot of us face, and especially the logistics of baseball and travel and facilities and equipment availability and those sorts of things that require you to be flexible and adaptable in your methodology. Um, there's the famous quote by Harrington Emerson, I think, that's principles are many, or methods are few, principles, or methods are many, principles are few. The person that understands principles can successfully select his own methods. And so understanding, taking an adaptation-based approach to training, understanding what the principles of training are, I think allows you to have that creativity to, accommodate whatever constraints, challenges, resources, limitations that you have as part of your specific circumstance. So while I love the weightlifting movements, um, and they would probably would be the first place that my mind would go, but it's obviously not the last place my mind would go. There are so many other things to consider aside from just what in an ideal world, what types of adaptations you might achieve, because as we all know, we don't live in the ideal. So you have to be able to be flexible. You have to be able to understand, even from an athlete preference standpoint, and what influence that might have on your decision making as a practitioner. Right? There's the common, thought that if an athlete doesn't believe in the program, then you're going to get less results running the perfect program than if you ran something that they believed in. I think there's a lot to that, and that's certainly part of the equation as well. So, like I said, by experience, I'm mostly a weightlifting person, but I think by perspective and trade, I've tried to um, take as diverse an approach as possible and appreciate what all the different possible methods there are. And again, going back to those root principles and using those to guide any sort of, selection or decision making.
This definitely wasn't on the list of things we are going to discuss, but I think it's super, super interesting for people. And I'd like to go down this track if that's all right and continue a little bit. So, you mind first, we'll go, okay, adaptation. The first option may be just in your head and it may live there. It may be binned because of various different things. It may be the weightlifting comes first. Can you take us through maybe an example that you've come across that you wanted to get X? Potentially, if we live in an ideal world, which we don't, but if we did, I would do this, and it's a weightlifting movement, weightlifting derivative. However, because of A, B, C, and X, Y, and Z, we've had to go this route. And Austin and John do outline that in the article, but I'd love to get your thoughts and maybe an example from you, if that's all right.
Sure. I mean, if the audience hasn't read that article, I definitely recommend them doing so because it really does go into detail um, within the world of professional baseball. A lot of those things that steer would steer somebody towards specific decisions or reasons why they would not be able to use the weightlifting movements effectively. Um, I think one example, which we might talk about a little bit more, um, you know, during my time at the UFC, of just seeing those athletes prepare and train, and looking at some situations where you have a long time before an athlete's fight, and they have a couple months or several months before their next fight, you're able to go through like an actual general prep phase where you might include some weightlifting movements. And maybe you're starting out with someone who has zero resistance training experience. You're going through basic barbell exercises, you're introducing some simple derivatives or variations from the weightlifting side of things. And the world of MMA and their training is just, it's so insane. Like there's so many different training elements that these people are managing on a day-to-day basis. From you have striking, you have grappling, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, then like actual MMA training, then you throw in the physical preparation on top of it, then the recovery and all that sort of stuff. um, so you have these people that they're training 5, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, and things may be going great. You're introducing, like I said, these basic weightlifting variations, and suddenly they tweak their shoulder during jujitsu or they tweak their knee. So, that may put certain exercises or variations off the table, at least in the short term, or maybe for the rest of the training block. And so, during that general prep phase, you're trying to build general physical capacities. And, if you've taken that specific exercise or group of exercises off the table, how are you going to adjust? Maybe you switch over to more like loaded plyometrics or something like that. And so I think even a, a world where resistance training hasn't always been very embedded within martial arts and MMA. The UFC has done a great job of, I think, kind of advancing the approaches to development and training within the MMA world and MMA space. Um, where you're getting up people who, for the most part, have a really low training age. Um, you really have to think about like the other demands that are being placed upon them. And again, you may have a lot of times run into a scenario where you do have the time, in terms of how long, from a learning standpoint, from a physical development standpoint, to make good use of the weightlifting movements um, in that space. But again, because of that, all the other things that they're doing, maybe that day or that week, those exercises are just off the table because of not necessarily injuries, but just slight tweaks or soreness, or fatigue that may just make that type of training ineffective. And so you have to be able to understand, all right, well, what's the next best thing, or what else can I do in place of that? There's another quote by the economist Thomas Sowell: "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." And so I, think keeping that in mind, that there's no perfect fit. It's you do something to gain in these things, but you also may lose out on some other areas. And it's being able to, as a practitioner, um, be willing to stand behind your decisions, and you have a good rationale and thought process in place for why you make those decisions to be able to defend them if you need to. Um, so yeah, I think like recognizing that and being able to be aware of a variety of different modalities, so that if you do have to make an adjustment, you have different options that you're able to call upon that are more or less appropriate depending on the circumstance.
That quote sounds like it's just summed up life itself, not just training.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
very
Definitely
deep.
use
I
it
like
not
it.
on just the training side, but from a like athlete monitoring standpoint, from both what we're trying to set up here and just in general. Yeah, and life in general, like you said, I think definitely an applicable quote.
So while we're on the UFC stuff, it kind of brings me to the next topic, which is on the list. So we're hopefully I'm prepared for what's to come. I think on the conditioning side, and I'm becoming aware of it, that a couple of years ago, well, probably the last 5, 6, 7 years, coaches are looking to track coaches for education, for inspiration, for knowledge, for experience in building fast people. And we're taking that, we're using it, we're integrating it in team sports, and I think that's happening now. What them track coaches are still having influence on what happens, and I think that's definitely happening more in the conditioning world. People are looking to different sports who are maybe a little bit further ahead in the conditioning realm, I suppose, and try to eke every little last bit of how it can be translated into baseball or basketball or football or soccer, whatever it is. So I'd just like to get your take on UFC and what you learned there from a conditioning perspective and how that's kind of influenced and helped you transition out and into other sports like baseball.
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, one of the most exciting things as a practitioner and as a fan of mixed martial arts, I think it's the ultimate N equals one sport in the world, right? You have so many different scenarios of working with a fighter who they just signed their first contract with the UFC. They're getting ready for their first fight, all the way through to champions in a weight class that are getting ready for a title defense, and everything in between. You have fighters that may be changing weight classes. So literally no two instances are the same with any of the fighters, and so that can create a lot of challenges. But I think that's for me like one of the exciting things about trying to solve those challenges, and how you come up with trade-offs, appropriate trade-offs for those scenarios. Um, but it does create a lot of difficulties in dealing with these different fractured timelines or these unpredictable timelines. Again, a scenario where you may be working with a fighter who's they don't have a fight scheduled and they get a call for a short notice fight in 2 weeks. What do you do from a conditioning standpoint with a fighter who only has 2 weeks to prepare, versus what do you do with a fighter who they're on a an 8 week training plan getting ready for a fight, and their opponent gets injured, so then the fight gets pushed back another several weeks, so you just completely disrupted the timelines there. So from a periodization standpoint, there's certainly a lot of challenges in terms of how you go about approaching that and addressing that. But I think that utilizing the principles of periodization and periodized programming still really can help you address all of those different scenarios from a conditioning standpoint. I talked before earlier about all of the different training elements that are involved in an MMA athlete's day to day, right? They have all of the different technical sessions that they might be engaged in at whatever point during their camp. They have again the physical preparation from an S&C standpoint. So you're really trying to make sure that you're aware of and managing all of the different units of training, and you're you should be, I think, trying to maximize training economy. Where are those opportunities that you can work on conditioning or specific elements of the conditioning within some sort of sport specific martial arts practice, versus what should you try to address within an S&C specific session. um, and I think kind of stepping back, looking at these timelines, right? In an ideal world, if you have the ability to run a full quote unquote training cycle, um, the principles of periodization, simple to complex, general to specific, high volume to low volume, less intense to more intense. I think from a conditioning standpoint, one of the clearest or most useful spectrums to think along is like global adaptation to local muscular endurance, and kind of how that transitions or fits across this ideal timeline. And so, like I said earlier, you may start to work with a fighter at any point along that spectrum, and they may not necessarily have gone through a GPP phase, but you pick them up uh, when they would be in a specific prep, or in the case of a fighter who's taking a short notice fight in 2 weeks. Again, that's not enough time from a physiological standpoint to chase cardiac adaptation or any sort of big changes in capacity. That could be enough time to work on some high intensity endurance through high intensity intervals, but with that comes some additional fatigue during a time where they should, especially if they weren't specifically preparing for this fight, probably should be focusing on sharpening their skills or making sure that they're up to the task from a technical standpoint. So we know the relationship between increased fatigue and technical execution. So is that something, what's the trade-off there that you're willing to go after? um, and I think, is that periodized training? If periodized training is like aligning your goals and objectives to the available timeline, then I think so. But some might argue otherwise. I mean, call it what you will, but the reality of the situation is like you have to understand what adaptations are possible within a given timeline. What's your proposed ideal for sequencing those adaptations, and then being able to again just coordinate with the technical side of things and the sport specific training. I think that's where you can make the biggest gains, or I guess have the biggest impact in terms of not adding too much additional fatigue outside of what they're already going to be doing, but making sure that you're having a training effect to the specific adaptations or conditioning that they might need.
For someone that hasn't worked in MMA and hasn't worked in baseball, the there seems to be quite a link between the two in terms of tight schedules, looking at that higher end, or however you want to look at it, further right end. So there's a conditioning effect, but there's not too much fatigue because these guys have got a fight tomorrow, but they've got a game tomorrow and then game the next day and then game the next day. Would that be right for someone, a complete novice in both
Yeah, I mean,
sports? Yeah.
that's definitely a realization that I've had coming in. Um, it's not something that I expected. Even my weightlifting experience, like I see so many similarities from my experience in weightlifting through to the MMA world, through to the baseball world. I think there's a lot of similarities there. The similarities between weightlifting and those other two are different than the similarities between MMA and baseball, but I think there are a lot of similarities. The ones that you mentioned, especially. Um, those tight schedules, a lot of training elements, the high skilled nature or focus on the technical execution and the importance of that. Definitely a lot there. Again, referencing that article by Austin and John, a lot of the things that impact the schedules and timelines from a training standpoint. Um, yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities there.
So from a conditioning point of view in baseball, just moving towards the present day, what does conditioning look like for your guys? Obviously, there's probably multiple buckets of athlete depending, like positional, schedule wise, like who's involved, who's not involved. But what does it look like for you, kind of
Yeah,
globally? And then feel free to dive into any of those kind of bucketed athletes.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think again, going back to like what are the demands of the sport? Well, we can focus on pitching specifically. Um, you know, by and large, it's not an aerobic task in the sense that it's not like long, continuous activity. But I would say that it's aerobic, or at least a high cardiac demand from the standpoint of when a pitcher is on the mound, their heart rate is 85% plus of heart rate max the entire time they're on the mound. Even though, with the introduction of the pitch clock this last season, they're throwing a pitch every 15 to 20 seconds, depending on if there's a person on base or not. And so that ability to repeat those high intensity efforts of throwing a pitch at max effort or near max effort with an elevated heart rate for that prolonged period of time, I think, uh, to me, points toward the importance of having a strong cardiovascular system um, from a very basic standpoint. Um, and then throw on top of that, like from a bioenergetic standpoint, you know, rephosphorylation of creatine is, aside from what happens in the, cellular fluid, primarily takes place through mitochondrial respiration, which requires aerobic capacity. So not to dive into the physiology too much, but I do think that there is a strong case for having a robust cardiovascular and aerobic system to support the efforts of pitching. Again, both from the cardiovascular strain that these pitchers experience while they're on the mound, and then also from the recovery in between those high intensity efforts. Um, and so I think it's pretty clear you can go into any physiology textbook to see how to improve those things. Now, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, like how do you do that within the environment that you're in, both with in terms of equipment that's available, in terms of time that's available, when during the year you have the ability to work with these athletes. One of the things that's new this year on the minor league side is there's a quote unquote dead period where you're not allowed to have contact or require those athletes to do specific work on behalf of the team, which runs from I think November 17th to January 1st of next year. And so that entire block of time, you can't prescribe specific work. You can like have a packet, much like in the NCAA in the U.S. in collegiate sports, where during certain periods of the year you can't have direct contact with the athlete. They're kind of on their own to do their work. And so that creates a lot of logistical problems and challenges to physical development. And so like that from an setting the base and foundation standpoint, I think that's kind of my general philosophy. And then obviously how that fits into the specific conditioning from a pitching standpoint of the arm, the structures of the arm and the shoulder being conditioned and ready to throw at high intensity, and what the throwing program looks like from the off season to preparing for that spring training camp to getting ready for the season. Again, if we're looking at from a macro periodization standpoint of your off season training, your preseason training, your in season training, the sport specific activity from a throwing standpoint is going to be different. And just like any other team sport or anything like that, your conditioning activities off the field should complement what the objectives of the sport specific training are, right? And so you may go from more like aerobic or general capacities in the off season from a conditioning standpoint to more introduction of different circuits, whether that's plyo metric circuits or med ball circuits or whatever, just a little bit more higher intensity, repeated effort type of circuits, to more like pure like um, high power output type activities as we get really close to the spring training period. And so again, those timelines may shift or emphasis may be more or less depending on the specific case. But I think that's kind of speaking in generalities, like hopefully a substantive answer. Give some meat and potatoes there. Yeah.
So from that, building that aerobic capacity, maybe more on a general level, and talking about maybe the preseason or off season, and I know people can pick up a physiology, but I'd love to know how you guys would do that, or your thinking of how to build that appropriately with all the things that you've mentioned taken into account, because there's so many variables that are going on. But how do you go about that? How do you, in terms of methods, how do you tackle it?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the easiest adaptations to go after in the off season would be increasing left ventricular volume, and you do that through low intensity steady state for really extended periods of time. Like it's boring, but it is super effective. And again, like from a compliance standpoint, there's probably a more nuanced conversation to land on like what the exact prescription is going to be. But if you're looking at, heart rates at, you know, probably pretty close to, around like the zone 2 training is like all the rage these days, right? Like it's probably a high focus and emphasis on, quote unquote zone 2 type training for really extended periods of time, like 30 minutes to an hour plus of, uninterrupted, zone 2 type training around that heart rate, intensity. Again, for me, that helps to get the, um, target the increase in the left ventricular volume to help increase the amount of blood that's getting pumped out with each beat to the periphery. And then I think as you transition closer to like the preseason camp, or spring training, then you might be able to go after, your longer, um, like longer intervals of, 4 to 5 to 6 minutes at, 80 to 90% heart rate max, maybe a little bit higher depending on the fitness level. But then, that's where you're getting into being able to stress the cardiovascular system and the heart specifically to sustain, that high heart rate for extended periods of time. And so for me, that's how I would kind of manage that transition between you're trying to build the general capacity of the heart to fill and deliver blood to the periphery. And then you're making it a little bit more specific with the longer intervals to at those higher intensities to be able to allow the heart to sustain or to manage, that workload or that output for those extended periods of time. And then again, that would probably shift into, shorter intervals, not necessarily, running or biking or anything, but more of the like whole total body, whether that's med ball or some sort of plyometric, interval based approach where you're doing like repeated high intensity outputs every, 10, 15 seconds, 20 seconds or so, 3 to 5 reps, whatever it might be, multiple sets of that, to kind of build in that robustness to be able to execute those near maximum or maximum efforts, back to back to back. So that would kind of be the general sequence of um, of the types of activities that I think would be appropriate.
Cool. Right. We're going to take a left turn and we're going to go to something that's probably definitely on my mind because we've published a couple of articles in this particular area that we're going to go into, and it's sports science and its perceptions. And I think there's a couple of people who are quite vocal on social media about this area, and we published an article recently by Jason Weber, Australian guy, um, strength and conditioning coach by trade, learned to code, and is very much moved into this particular area. And I'll just read a quote by Mike Boyle. Teams need to hire more/better coach and spend less time on the data part. Our field is absolutely moving in the wrong direction. So I'd just love to get your opinion as the director of sports science at a large organization. Your how you read that. Like, does that surprise you? Does that frustrate you? How does that kind of sit?
Um, well, one, it doesn't surprise me, and it's only frustrating if people aren't willing to have the more nuanced conversation around the what and the why. Um, I'm never going to argue that we don't need better coaches or that, there isn't room for any coach to continually improve. I think that's something that we all should be doing regardless of our role, regardless of our title or organization that we work in or whatever. Um, I think that that's an important thing. What I think gets lost in the message, and I don't want to speak for Mike and, put words in his mouth, but what I think gets lost with that type of messaging or the way that it comes across to me is that relying on our intuition is enough or it should be enough, um, which in some cases maybe depending on what the stakes are, depending on the scope, the scale, the magnitude, and all that sort of stuff. um, and I definitely would agree that there are lots of instances where people become too reliant on the data or they expect too much of the data. I think for me, coming in to the organization, um, there was as much like scaling back on different initiatives and reducing data that was coming in from you know specific sources as much as it was like trying to add anything new from a data standpoint. Um, and I think where people go wrong is when any specific piece of data is not tied to a specific objective or outcome or decision making process. It's just data collection for the sake of data collecting, um, which I don't think serves anybody well. It in a world of finite resources, both in terms of money, time, human resources. The number of staff that we have available. Um, you know, our main job descriptions for an S&C coach is to be a coach, right? It's not necessarily to interact with the data. Same thing for any sport medicine practitioner, even for a dietitian. Like the people facing, the athlete facing component of those roles should predominate. And I think again, where people go wrong is diving headfirst into the data or into a specific technology without fully defining what the process is for integrating that data into their decision making processes. Um, David Bishop has a really good review that kind of outlines a framework for applied sports science and a problem solving approach to applied sports science and being problem driven, and using that to kind of inform your processes. Pat Ward has talked several times about uh, the acronym is PPDAC, which stands for problem, plan, data, analysis, and conclusion. But again, a very problem first, like identify the problem first approach. Um, and I think that's an element of you know sports science, the scientific method. Some flavors are more problem oriented. Of trying to identify there's a problem that we're trying to solve, and then how do we get there? What information do we have available? Like, what is our current level of understanding? What is the gap in our knowledge that we need to fill in order to be able to make a better decision? How do we get that information or fill that knowledge gap? Once we get that, what do we understand about that new knowledge within the context of all the other knowledge that we have available to us? And what are the decisions that we're going to make off the back end of that? And so I think, again, certainly there's an element where, especially in this day and age, because of how much technology is available, which is both, I think, a blessing and a curse in some ways, but it is so ubiquitous, it's not going to go away or decrease in how much is available. It's only going to increase. So I think there's some level of responsibility on practitioners to maintain or attain a certain level of scientific literacy and data literacy so that they can capitalize that information, or capitalize on that information. Um, yeah, so I guess that's my initial volley of response to your question.
I like it. I like it. And it comes back to me. It comes back to sports science being so heavily linked to tech when there's actually, like you mentioned, numerous names there. It's not just the technology. Like it's the process of how you go about your work that is the scientific principle. It just happens that there's a million and one bits of technology that's been thrown at us in this, 2023, and those scientific principles are used to actually understand this. But I think that maybe Mike is coming at it from these just tech guys. When you're a coach, you've coached, and now you're director of sports science, so you've got that. You've made that really good link between those kind of two stories. But I think often there's still that perception of sports science just means sticking GPS units on and downloading them, when it's so much more than that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for why that version of sports science kind of, you know, proliferates unchecked. A lot of it has to do with a lot of times just the decision makers don't have a health and performance background, or they don't have a sports science background, so they don't know what to check, or um, they're not necessarily subject matter experts in a specific field or space, or around a specific technology. So they just see things as a tool and hope that if they have the tool, then something good will happen. um, and so I think a lot of times, like, you have well-intentioned but slightly misguided individuals or organizations, that, again, they create a scenario where you have this glut of technology and data that is, it's just there. um, and yeah, I think the more that you can have people involved in the conversation to, guide the ship, so to speak, and try to make sure that there is alignment between the specific initiatives that you're after, or technology that you're bringing on board. um, I think that's really important. And I know from my experience, like, one of my big motivating factors, aside from like the educational component of diving in during the PhD, but as a coach, like, I dived into the weightlifting biomechanics research and the training theory and all that sort of stuff, and I read all of the papers, but I got to a point where reading the papers no longer gave me the answers that I need. Like, there were still questions that I couldn't answer, and certainly isn't the case in every sport or environment. But for me, in order to get those answers, I needed to upskill and gain the ability to investigate those answers through the use of technology for technique evaluation, or whatever it might be. um, and so I think that's definitely part of it. um, I think the ecosystem that you're in, being in a professional sport versus a private facility, or even within professional sports, right? If you're the only S&C coach, and like, you're the entire performance department, like, there's only so much you can do in terms of bandwidth, right? And hopefully you can focus as much as possible on coaching. Um, for us, like, even in baseball, there are a lot of organizations that have a quote unquote sports science or performance science department to support, all of the other areas of the org. But there's a lot of different specific structures of the department. Like, we have a very different structure than they do at the Giants, or they do at the Yankees, or they do at any other organization. And like, that whole ecosystem of within professional sport, within our organization, we have Department of Applied Sports Science, we have a Department of Analytics, we have an IT department, we have a Systems and Development department that takes care of all of our databases. Like, you have all of these different groups that contribute a different piece to the like data pipeline and solution puzzle. Whereas some organizations, again, you just have a sports science department, or you just have an S&C slash sports scientist. Like, those are two very different scenarios, and I think appreciating that as well is is really important, because what you can accomplish in both, like, even though you may have the same aspirations or like vision or goals, how that manifests in terms of like what you're able to invest your resources, your time, your attention, your focus on, are going to be vastly different.
I was actually doing a roundtable middle last week with Barry Drust, who works at a university over here in the UK, but was Patrick Ward's prof doc or PhD supervisor. Maybe still is. Don't know where Patrick is with that. I think he's finished, isn't he? But he was talking about this scientific process of people looking to the, always asking, oh, show me the research on that. Show me the research. Where's the paper on that? And at some point, you've got to go, and people will get to a certain stage and go, that's not going to be answered. I'm going to have to do it myself. Like, I'm going to have to figure this out for myself. And you've got to have that scientific background to do that in a rigorous enough way to be able to get the level of answer, maybe not a peer-reviewed level, but a level of answer that you're kind of happy with to move forward. And I think just saying that you need to, like you mentioned at the start, that the coaching eye is enough, or my intuition is enough, my experience is enough. Maybe we're getting beyond that, and people need to accept that coaches are sports scientists. Like, you have to have that scientist in you to be able to answer these more complex questions, like you mentioned there. Especially if you're a lone soldier, and you're the sports scientist, you're nutritionist, you're the S&C coach. You have to figure things out for yourself, and you have to have that scientific brain to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, a couple of things in response, the whole concept of evidence-based practice, and like, there's three pillars to that, right? Where you have scientific research, or like body of knowledge, you have the clinical and practical experience, and then you have like the patient or client values. And within our world, yes, randomized controlled trial, whatever, is like the highest or most like it's the strongest, most robust form of evidence. But we don't always have that. And as a practitioner, you have to make a decision regardless of what evidence you have available to you. You have to be able to use the best evidence that you have available. And sometimes that is just some like quick and dirty analysis that you did of, your athletes, whatever performance data. Sometimes there is existing literature to be able to draw from. And so I think it's getting away from the idea of like, just because we don't have the quote unquote best evidence, that we don't have any evidence. Again, you as a practitioner, you ultimately have to make a decision, and everyone's free to, make their decisions how they want. But if, as long as you can have some sort of backing or rationale to your decision, again, whatever evidence, using whatever evidence you have available to you, I think that's the important thing. And then to your point about, you know, we can all be sports scientists, and this goes back to like the working definition of sports science that I like the most is sports science is the application of scientific principles and the scientific method to improve athlete performance, health, development, what have you. And to me, there's nothing in that definition that says only a sports scientist can do sports science. Like, it is an approach, right? As an S&C coach, I can practice sports science. As a dietitian, I can practice sports science, by incorporating these different methods. And that's one of the things that I enjoyed, and what I think was most valuable about the educational model at ETSU and studying under Dr. Stone is you go there, and if you're in the grad program, whether you're in the master's program or the PhD program, you get assigned to a sport, whether that's through ETSU athletics or one of the other universities that are in the area. And you are assigned as the S&C coach and or sports scientist for that sport. And regardless of what your assignment is, you're involved in the athlete monitoring program, doing the data collection, creating the report off the back end, using that information as the S&C coach, or being able to interpret that information as a sports scientist to deliver to the sport coach or to the S&C coach. So that very much is ingrained as part of the training and education there. Of there is no separation really, right? Like, you are both, and you need to learn how to function as both. Which I really found a lot of value in that. Looking at other educational programs that are popping up, that's a model that is becoming more common, which I think is a good thing in the U.S. at least, becoming more common. I know it's more common already, or more established internationally, but I think we're getting there, and I do think that that's an important aspect. Like, we can all, even though we might not all be quote unquote sports scientists, we can all practice sports science regardless of what our role is.
I think that's a great message. Great message. I've got one more question for you before I let you go. You mentioned reducing data sources, and that was one of the first things you did when you came into post. Not to throw any companies under the bus, but what tech was maybe sidelined because it wasn't been actioned, or it was just taking too much time, or
There
for
are
whatever
instances
reason it's been
yeah. I
riverside?
mean, there are multiple reasons, for different tech for different reasons. Some it was because one, we just didn't have the bandwidth, or I felt our efforts would be better focused elsewhere. Others were I didn't feel or we didn't feel that um, that the science was there, that there was a good rationale for investing our energy there. Um, yeah, and I mean ultimately it comes down to a bandwidth issue. Even though we have what is a relatively large staff within the MLB from a sports science standpoint, again we have a limited number of things, time, attention, all that sort of stuff that we can devote ourselves to. And so it really is just about aligning our focus toward the things that we're going to have the most impact for our coaches and for our support staff and for our players.
You'd have to mention brand names, but is there any areas that did get kind of pushed to the side? This is the common thing, Aaron. Sorry to, I don't want to push it if you're not comfortable. Like, please say. But it's very much a common thing that I'm speaking to people, and it's not about adding anymore. Like, adding's been done. People are going into positions and going, let's weed this out. There's just too much going on. Let's get it down from 8 things to 4 things, or 3 things to 2 things. So, I'm just interested, and feel free to veto it if. Feel free to veto if need be.
Yeah, I probably won't go into more detail on that
That's
one.
cool. That's
Sorry.
cool. That's cool. No, that's fine, mate. That's absolutely fine. But like I say, it is. I think it's an interesting point, and I think it's very common across people that speak to on the podcast. So no, I appreciate that. Right, mate. We're coming up to the hour that I've kept you. So if anyone wants to reach out, if anyone wants to get in touch about anything that we've spoken about or anything else, just keep in touch with you and keep up to date with what you've got going on. What's the best place?
I'm active on Twitter mostly in terms of social media. My handle is at Aaron J Cunanan, and that's consistent across whether that's Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Like I said, I'm most active on Twitter and then probably LinkedIn. Um, so those would be the best places to reach out.
Perfect. Aaron, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming on and being so honest and open about what you guys do. Really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you.
thanks, Rob. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Cheers, buddy. Bye bye.